first global seed taking on the 11th. Let's see how much those standings matter.
Jack, fancy meeting you here again. So it's kind of like we talked about at the beginning. I'm really expecting to see obviously similar pulls. We'll see a bit of variation, probably, maybe rather, as soon as they kill Imran in the bottom of the ship. But right off the bat here, we're just going to see that straight pull to Imran, pulling everything together. But Jack, one of the main things to watch out for right away, of course, is that splash damage on the melee. Speaking of which, there is a ton of melee, triple melee running over on Method.
And both sides, really. You're seeing Games Revolted there, double Windwalker with, of course, the Rogue. And on the side of Method running, Rogue, Demon Hunter, and Monk here. So tons and tons of melee, and there is going to be, like you said, a lot of that extra splash damage that you have to watch out for. So many of these mobs can be so lethal. You are going to be having, of course, the group-wide fear coming out from Imran there. And they're both sides doing an excellent job being able to take care of all the mobs here. As you're seeing, it's going to be...
that Monk damage coming out of both sides, topping up the 40 mil over on Games Revolted. But just tons of... just the amount of melee damage coming out of these groups, and of course, the single target damage that these rogues are benefiting from that Shuriken Storm, Jack. Let's talk a bit about Imran, because we don't have much time as he's about to die in just a moment. You do have to avoid that AoE fear. We, of course, do have the ads being summoned in just a moment here. Players need to make sure, which shouldn't be too hard, of course, with the Holy Paladins and 3 melee. Moving close to the boss to spawn the ads nearby, allowing the tank to pick them up nice and safely. And then, of course, that super dangerous overhead slash, the dark slash from the boss that the tank needs to prepare for.
And the dark slash coming out, especially when you're having all these little ads that are coming out from the boss, of course, can just be so lethal here. So, like you said, it is very important to make sure you're kind of watching out for a lot of it, is because they are so heavily weighted towards melee here. But also important to note, we are running with Fortified, Quaking, and Bursting of the affixes for these dungeons. Like I said, they're going to be predetermined here. Both teams, of course, getting Imran down very, very rapidly here. And like you said, this is where we're going to start hopefully seeing a little bit of a diversity in maybe how they're going to be pulling the bottom deck. But then after that, it's just going to be all straight of focus, getting everything onto the top deck right after Harbron.
And Games Revolted having the quicker time here, moving downstairs to the bowels of the ship, as I like to say. So it usually starts with a larger pull here. It's pretty scary, this pull. You do have a lot of area limited by not only Quaking, one of the affixes here, but by the barrels going by, the Defiant Strike, of course, the slashes coming in from the the Swift Blades as well, not to mention the amount of tank damage going out. So it's pretty scary with this first pull once they round out, of course, to the corner for the dogs.
It's one of the scariest things about Maw of Souls is because it is going to be that opening map that everyone's going to be preparing for, and because the EU region has been so strong, it's very scary really to be watching out for, any kind of accidental deaths. You're seeing, both sides getting one death on each side, having to deal with so much melee damage onto melee players, so much close quarters combat going on. It can be so annoying to deal with, especially when we're having to also deal with Quaking here. So it's a lot more stress that you're going to be putting onto the healers here. You're seeing, Imba is just kind of keeping his distance here with wings up, making sure he's getting everybody topped off. He'd, of course, love to be able to be right in melee, getting, as much damage out as he possibly can, but at this point he has to make sure he's, not clogging up melee, not having any kind of extra, inconvenience to any of the other people there, and is able to kind of top people off. So you're seeing, he's bringing wings into that Rule of Law, into Avenger, and just making sure he's staying, getting everybody alive.
So Games Revolted actually opting to deal with the Mariner, which we usually see skipped, pulled to the side, along with that Grime Lord. It's a lot of damage. Now, this is a mob that perhaps we're not familiar with here for the viewers because everybody always skips, but people do often skip this. It's just a ton of damage, and he has just so much health, but they're going to kill him off. Games Revolted, and then it'll allow them to pull a bit less once they get upstairs after they deal with Harbron. Typically from the typical pull from Method, though, as we see on the left side of the screen, they do pull it to the side. The tank opts to die. They res them upstairs. They pull the 2 champions, and here I do expect to see, as we're seeing now, they run upstairs to Harbron. Now, they do have a triple melee comp, so the interrupts should be manageable on these champions, making sure that the AoE fear doesn't get out as they go up to Harbron, and they should have enough interrupt left over as well for the ad that Harbron spawns.
Yep, and as you're seeing here, they're just making sure they're getting it all in together, making, like I said, it's a lot easier to be able to get all these interrupts when you're having such a melee-heavy composition that you're going to be focusing on here. But you are seeing, of course, both sides going to be engaging with the boss here, with Method actually opting to have those champions pulled into it, whereas Gamers Revolted, of course, did not. So it might have, a little bit of a extra advantage there when you're able to get a little bit of the extra trash cleave down. Both sides are, going to be pretty well set up for trash, that they're going to be able to pull everything once Harbron is dead. So
And important to know, Jack, on that point with the trash you were mentioning, Games Revolted actually hasn't used their Bloodlust yet. They're saving it likely for this big pull coming up on the ship after Harbron. And without the Bloodlust, they still managed to get the faster time on Imran and all the trash at the start, just showing you the real power of that double monk combo. So it's going to be huge damage coming up from them, and they're already a bit further on Harbron, 10% along. But let's talk about Harbron real quick as well. We do, of course, have the ads that spawn on one random player, 4 of them, stunning that player and doing damage. You'll have to kill all of these ads off quickly for that player to stop stop taking the damage. We, of course, have the one mob that we spawn on the side, as we mentioned, needs to be interrupted. And there is that beautiful sight that, Jack, that I know you're no stranger to, unfortunately.
Oh, thanks.
You need to dodge it, make sure you move to the side. Not getting hit, it does do a ton of damage.
Yeah, but seeing the fragments coming out there, they were just clearing up all the rest of those ads, and of course getting on top of the servant. He will of course have his just AoE nuke cast that just needs to be interrupted very quickly. And it's also kind of annoying when you're having to deal with this triple melee comp for both teams, because you have to deal with the quaking, you have to be able to deal with any of the extra void zones that are spawning onto the ground. And the other thing is that the servant ads are spawning on top of players, so you want to make sure that none of the ads are getting spawned in areas that are just covered in void zones. So you're seeing a lot of movement coming out from both teams here, and Games Revolted already getting the boss down just a little bit quicker, and they're just consistently moving just a little bit faster without using Bloodlust.
Really impressive performance from them here so far. They're going to pull the entire ship, as mentioned here. There goes the Bloodlust. We see it flashing on the screen now. Going to expect to see an absolute immense amount of damage coming out of these monks as they start to skyrocket up the meters. Now, there is a bit of a finite time for the tank to safely live in these pools, that you really want to get this trash down before the tank needs to turn on a defensive note and start kiting backwards. As we can see, the mobs are about 10 to 20% on the screen right now. Immense damage coming out of the monks. Harboron about to fall on the left side for Method, and they'll be doing this pull soon as well.
Yeah, and as you're seeing, and again, it's a timer that's in your head as you're seeing Chill is just running away, getting kiting as many mobs as he possibly can. And there is that timer that's in your head, not only for the tank but also for the healer when you're having to deal with any of the bursting stacks. They did an excellent job just to make sure that they're going to be getting all of them in together, and also being able to handle all the bursting stacks with CDs up, with wings up, with aura mastery up. They did have one more death that was incurred during the course of that pull, but it was well worth it when they're already pulling so far ahead of Method right now.
Yeah, I mean, they're already on Skjall right now with all those skeletons, as we said last week, Jack. These deaths, especially in a map this short, as Robert was mentioning earlier, is going to be a really big deal. I mean, it's a big deal always on the maps, but with a map so short, those extra 5 seconds add up a lot. So that 10-second advantage that Games Revolted had is now cut down to 5. Could be something that we might have to keep an eye on by the end of the map. But they are in a really prime position right now, keeping in mind for those at home, of course, that this fog wall does not drop until all of the trash needed for the dungeon is completed, after which they will have access to Helya, the last boss of the dungeon. Method only now, though, pulling Skjall, so they're really going to need to make up some time here in order to catch this first map.
Yeah, and you're seeing here Skjall is about 15% for Games Revolted, right, as Method is going to be engaging with him on the other side there. It's very, very important to be able to make sure you're catching up to that. But also important to note that the Bloodlust timer is about 3 minutes left for Method, so they might barely just be able to get it at the very, very end of the boss, but they might actually have to wait for the first submerge before that goes out.
Yeah, and even then they might only get part of it. And with the kind of DPS that these teams are putting out, it wouldn't be out of the question, especially in this fortified setting, if Helya were to drop within just one phase. So we'll have to see that. But of course, we'll have to start with the primary phase, the first phase that Games Revolted has in just a moment here. We do have 6 tentacles, a combination, of course, of grasping and the destructors. Destructors being very dangerous to the tank. Somebody must be in melee range, otherwise they'll pulse on the raid. You do have to kill 6 of them in order for her to transition to her second phase. And as well, Jack, something once again you're no stranger to, you have to avoid one side of the ship to make sure that you don't get
here. Hang on now.
For that lobby comment last week. We'll talk about this later at home over dinner. So you do have to avoid one side of the ship, otherwise essentially you will be one-shot by that spray.
That's right, and as you're seeing the positioning there by the melee, they're making sure they're kind of hugging the sides of the ship there. And like you said, you have to watch the edges there because you are getting another death there going out for Games Revolted.
There goes their battle res too.
And there's their last battle res. So they need to make sure they're kind of hugging the edges of the ship because there are going to be some fairly predetermined areas as to where these tentacles are going to be spawning from. But one of the nicest things is you're going to be able to hug the edges, and that's not where any tentacles are going to be kind of getting into your way. So it's a safety thing. It's also making sure that you're able to have a good idea of where all the tentacles are going to be spawning at, and making it a little bit easier to get on top of the destructor tentacles and being able to cleave onto the graspings in the process.
Right, you are, Jack. As Helya is losing her patience, perhaps she shouldn't be in the medical industry. We have to mention, I think there's 1 or 2 tentacles left for Games Revolted. Now, for the second phase, we do rotate in a 1-minute up phase where Helya you can damage her and she does her abilities, after which she submerges for about 20 seconds. Players will just kind of have to dance around holding their feet, doing nothing really, as Games Revolted right now is transitioning to that phase. She will shatter the front of the ship, come up, and then players will have access to her. No Bloodlust, as we mentioned, of course, available for Games Revolted as they use it on the trash, but Method with only 70 seconds left on their Bloodlust, they might be able, as you mentioned, of course, Jack, to see that bloodlust towards the end of the last phase.
Yeah, and Games Revolted here. But one of the things you always have to look out for is if Games Revolted is going to be, like you said, be able to get that one phase, it's going to be a huge, huge damage requirement to make sure you're getting to that point here. That's why you're seeing, on the side of team here for Games Revolted, popping Wings, popping Avenger, just dumping as much damage as possibly can into the boss, because there's a huge advantage, like you said, because the Submerge does last for such a long period of time if you're able to get that one phase off.
And I mean, it all comes down to this right now. Both teams at 3 deaths on the board, so there's no differential there, no advantage for either team, unless, of course, we see a death later. No battle res on the board available for Games Revolted for another few seconds. Method about to get their second one should they need it. Hopefully none of the teams need it, though, because that would be an extra 5-second penalty. Games Revolted now at 75% on Helia. Important to note, of course, Helia does not actually die. You don't have to get her to 0%. She will finish the fight at around 70.5%, and she will submerge after about 3 breaths, if I'm not mistaken. So that's the kind of timeline that Games Revolted is looking to try and beat to really take this home.
And it looks like they're having the last breath coming out here for Helia there as they're getting her down to 72% here. So it's very, very close. I think she is going to go down for the Submerge. She does go down, so they do have to wait, like you said, that that extra period of time before she does come back up. So there's very, very tight here to make sure. But Method is just getting their bloodlust back. They need to be doing as much damage as they can, because this is their opportunity. This is one chance.
This is their one chance. You only get one chance. No. So this is their one shot right here to try and take this match. They have to kill Helia in this Submerge. As Games Revolted, Helia just reemerges now, and they finish the fight off. And I think that's all she wrote, actually. Games Revolted takes the first match in what kind of is a bit of a shock at the very first get-go on the gate here.
Definitely a shock if you look at the global rankings for the time trials, but again, this was 1 versus 11 globally. That is not a big margin, and we were even saying, like, how much does how much do time trial rankings really matter when you get to this point? And we see these are 2 very high caliber teams. Both performed super well. It seemed like the triple melee double monk strat for Games Revolted really paid dividends. Fraggy, watching the meters, Fraggy individually seemed to have the higher DPS, but between that facing off against 2 monks in a triple melee comp, that did work out.
That second monk just did work compared to the DH over on Method side. It really just at the very get-go, the whole pull with Imran, they didn't even pop Bloodlust and they got out of there faster. Harboron was down 25% faster. Everything was just done faster. Both teams with a few slip-ups, of course, 3 deaths on either side. One of them on purpose for Method because of that tank skip. But, just a bit of sloppy play from either one of them. But, Rob, as you said, we said this every week. Jack, you've been here, of course, unfortunately. But you've been here every single week. We say this every week. The difference between the seeds and the rankings in the board that we're seeing is really quite minimal. I mean, there's not big difference, and case in proof right here, between the 1st and 8th seed. I mean, these are all exceptional teams. It's anyone's game sometimes.
Well, it is going to be map 1 going to Games Revolted. Method still has the opportunity to turn it around, but now they're going to be facing a disadvantage. We'll find out how the rest of the series goes when we're back from a short break. Welcome back. Method currently staring down a 0-1 deficit in this first series of the day. And guys, we talked about how important this first map was, but let's literally break it down just a little bit more. At this point now, they have to get through so much more if they want to get out of this series and advance to the winner's bracket.
I'm actually going to throw this to Jack because he was just oozing wanting to talk about the advantage of winning that first map. So
One of the scariest things, when you're into this tournament is how much you want to practice and what dungeons you want to practice for. Because if you're going into, say, for example, the winner's bracket, you're saying, oh, we're always going to be having, this game to start, then this game to start, then this game to start. And these are going to be the big things we want to practice on. But you also have to look at how much teams are going to be practicing their counter picks versus the set maps if they're going to be winning, of course. So how much a team is going to be practicing Maw of Souls versus how much are they working on their counter picks, or how much are they working on being just really well diversified with all the dungeons. So, if you're the 8th seed, and I like the strategy coming out of Games Revolted, if you're the 8th seed, you want to be practicing as hard as you can for that very first map there, making sure you're going to be able to get that win and then have a strong counter pick, hopefully in the 3rd series.
I mean, just coming out the gate, the monks just tore through everything. They used the Bloodlust well. There's a good skip from them, so they executed extremely well and are definitely giving Method a run for their money. Method now for the map pick. I do have that information. Did you guys hear, or is that just me?
No, please let us
know. Oh,
yeah.
wow.
Sure.
Just holding suspense for a while. No, it is going to be Eye of Ajara with Grievous now.
Okay.
Excellent. We haven't seen Eye of Ashara since the Chinese weekend. I think it was. We only saw it once as
I think so. So we're gonna have Fortified, Bolstering, and Grievous.
I do like this Eye of Ajara pick. I heard you guys kind of talking about it in the China weekend. There's a lot of different ways you can approach this map. So I think, compared to Maw, which is relatively straightforward, it feels like it's mostly solved by teams. There's little bells and whistles, but most of it is pretty much solved. Eye of Ajara still feels like it's pretty wide open in terms of how you approach the order of the bosses, what you want to do with the trash. I kind of like this from Method in terms of just having like a pocket counter pick.
Yeah, and one of the things is at the start of the instance when there's so much deadly trash that you have to be focusing on, it just takes a lot more time, because everyone's always seen those very large crab pulls, right? Where you're saying, oh, okay, we can actually just if we can get past some of this early trash pull as little as possible, then we just have heaps and heaps of crabs to be able to steam up here for everybody. So that's what I really like about the pick is, especially when they have the rogue, when they're able to kind of get past a lot of these mobs, skip as much trash at the start of the instance, makes things so much easier later on.
Let's slow it down there for a second, though. We are in bolstering, right? Mm-hmm. So they're only going to be able to pull so much. I mean, we've all seen, different streams and experienced it ourselves where somebody ends up pulling all the
large crabs.
The crabs and the gilb, and everyone pulls everything, and then you have one guy left over at 2% that actually has 400 million health, and it takes 10 hours to kill. So they're going to have to be careful what they pull. And, in a ways, you could kind of argue this maybe mildly counters the double monk, who just love going on a storm and AoEing everything down. So they're going to have to be a bit more careful. Not that the DH doesn't like doing that, of course, the Havoc does as well, but perhaps a bit more care will be taken by Method with that, paying attention to damaging the correct mobs, making sure that nothing gets too out of hand with that bolstering, but also just slows down the entire dungeon period. I mean, you can't do what we saw in Maw of Souls, where you just pull all the trash together right into the boss.
Yeah, definitely more strategic in how you approach this trash, so very eager to see what we do. And I'm also eager to get to the beach episode of the Mythic Dungeon Invitational, as we're going to head over to Ajara now. The teams are ready. Let's go ahead and pop on over. So, we had the opening of Maw of Souls, kind of a little bit of a Ship of the Damned theme going, but we're just going to go ahead and slow it down, have a nice relaxing trip to Ashazara.
Surf's Up champions entering into the Eye of Ashara here. God. And like I said, it's going to be a fantastic instance to be able to see, what they're going to be able to skip around, what they're going to be able to kind of dodge in terms of, the specific mobs here, and what kind of opportunities do they really want to be going for to be able to, like I said, skip as much as possible and get a lot of the easier crab pulls going in together. But you've seen very similar pulls coming out of here by Method and Games Revolted.
Yeah, and I'm not surprised to see this pull coming out of Method. I see them practice this dungeon a lot. Similar pulls coming out of both sides, as you said, with those first 4 Naga at the start, right over to the huts, grabbing a few of the turtles along the way. Probably 1, maybe 2 pulls left before we get to Parjas, the first boss. Now, it is bolstering. And even at the last few % of these mobs, they can hit the tank pretty damn hard, Jack.
Yeah, now is taking no chances with this. You're making sure he's kiting away, just like Chill is as well. And that's one of the nicest things. You want to make sure you're, keeping your distance. Thankfully, you don't have to worry about any threat as long as, you're getting in there for this early pulse. When you do actually have to start jumping out, just get a quick Wraith Walk going out there, and having, everything kited out and just slowed so easily by your Death and Decay. Like I said, you're probably going to be like 1 or 2 other pulls, probably just 1 before they actually do engage with Parjash, because they will not be able to pull any additional trash into the boss. You see a lot of times when you're in, non-bolster weeks, you're just able to pull everything in Lust. And but that will not happen because of bolster.
Didn't want to cut you off. Of course, that would be rude. Method going actually stealthing right through straight to Parja. So they're pulling the first boss right away. Important to note on this boss, he will summon 2 adds. Of course, these adds do not bolster the boss. One of them is a melee add, and one is a caster. The caster eventually will... Ooh, getting some damage in on Gingy there. Now, keep in mind, we're not in a tyrannical setting, but this boss can hit quite hard. A lot of bleed coming out as well. But the caster is important to interrupt, as she will heal occasionally, so you want to make sure it doesn't get on the boss, doesn't get on the adds. And the boss also will do this charge forward, afterwards targeting one of the players with a spear, as we see that kind of death arrow above their head. That player will need to hide behind one of the 2 Naga that the boss summons, or of course they can get Jack bopped or immune themselves with perhaps an IBF from the DK, as we saw there.
Yeah, well, it was actually nice you were able to see the Demon Hunter is able to use Blade Dance there to be able to just soak up that spear, you know, in effect dodging the spear but soaking it up for somebody else. Being able to have that intercept can be so nice here, and Method just absolutely annihilating Parjesh here, getting him down to 8%. Games Revolted is still at 25, and huge damage, and that's what you want to see out of your counter pick. Just such a strong showing right off the pull, making sure you're kind of setting the tone for this. And because, of course, you know, Method is getting Parjesh down very quickly, and they're pulling all the rest of the mobs into the next trash bag. But it was also very interesting watching, you know, having to deal with the bleed that Parjesh will end up putting out, because it can kind of go on anybody when they're in this all melee composition, because usually we'll focus on just one of the range, and you kind of know who you want to be healing every single time, or just kind of getting a bop on them to remove that bleed, especially because we are dealing with Grievous. It was, you know, kind of this extra stress putting on Imba, making sure you're focusing on, you know, who has that bleed, getting on top of them very quickly and getting it topped off.
So big pull from Method here on the left side of the screen. Have to make sure to DPS everything evenly as to not get anything too bolsters. Games Revolted right on their tail doing a similar pull of their own. Now, Games Revolted having the higher damage output overall from their 3 DPS on Parjesh, but lower damage output from the tank and the healer, which Jack, of course, we do know adds up quite a bit. Games Revolted just now starting on the pull as Method finishes off that last bolstered mob. They'll be heading over in the direction of the second boss. Now, we do know, of course, that actually all 4 bosses are optional in terms of the order that you do at the start of the dungeon. Typically, we will see Parjesh, followed by either Lady Hate Coil or Serpentrix, one of the 2, depending on which one teams want to tackle first. Another big pull here from Method. Now, of course, a lot of these are neutral mobs, which don't fully follow the rules of bolstering. Yeah,
and as you said, you know, you do have those choices. You do have, you know, those extra opportunities to kind of see where you want to be going next. A lot of times you'll see, for example, groups will just clear trash for the next, you know, 6 or 7 minutes until they get Lust back for Hate Coil to be able to take care of. But you also have to keep in mind, it's a 22. It's going to be a lot less lethal to be able to deal with, you know, the lightning storms that are coming out from Hate Coil. And, you know, like you said, because we do have, you know, rogues on both sides, you will have those opportunities to be able to have the Shuriken storms, pump out a little bit more single target damage. So they do have, you know, a lot of options ahead of them. Very interested in what they're going to do.
Now, of course, a lot of health left here on this turtle in a shell. It will take them quite a bit of time to get the rest of that damage down. Games Revolted, once again, doing a similar plus. As you said, Jack, we're seeing really similar strategies coming out of these teams. The Method just seems to be executing it a bit better, a bit faster, which makes sense. This is their counter pick. Grievous was their choice. You do have to kill 2 of those Arcanists in order to get Lady Hate Coil to spawn. You don't have to kill her first, as we mentioned. You can move over to Serpentrix, but there is a lot of option with this dungeon, expecting also that we will likely, especially with that Demon Hunter, see the skip coming from the boat towards King Deepbeard once we do get to that point, Jack.
Yeah, the boat pull, of course, is going to make things, or the boat skip is going to make things a lot easier. There is just this part of a wrecked ship that is, of course, at the base of, you know, it is actually the exit of where you're going to be coming from.
Wrecked ship, indeed.
King Deep here. So you are able to have the opportunity to have your Demon Hunter, you know, double jump, get on top of there, and you are able to have, you know, your rogues be able to get onto, you know, on either 3-person mounts, be able to get, you know, 2 people mounted up with them. They shadow step up to the Demon Hunter. It makes things a lot easier just to quickly get up there and take care of, you know, getting to that boss, skipping around a lot of the more lethal and more annoying trash here.
Of course, that snail thought he could get away, but not to the wrath of now. He does grip it over to the rest of the goos, and they do DPS it down. Games Revolted right on their tail as they finished up that last Arcanist. Now, Jack, let's take a moment here, of course, to tell the viewers at home what bolstering, of course, and Grievous mean. Bolstering means that every time you kill a trash mob, it will buff the surrounding mobs, including bosses around it, by 20% health and damage, which is why it's important to kill everything as evenly as you can so that they don't get too much of that health boost. And lastly, Grievous does mean that anytime the players are below 90% health, they will incur a stacking dot up to 5, which can only be cleared once you're healed above 90%, Jack. You're no stranger to that.
That's right, and one of the things is watching, you know, some of the different boss fights here for, you know, like Lady Hate Coil and, you know, for Serpentrix, a lot of times it's a lot easier to be able to clear out all these Grievous stacks. When you get into a long, drawn-out fight, for example, with like Wrath of Ashara, when you have that constant ticking damage is going to be going out, it can be a lot more impactful in dealing with those extra Grievous stacks because you're constantly having to get everybody topped off. And in the situation with Holy Paladins, right, a lot of times you may be focusing that around your Beacon of Virtue windows, be able to get everybody topped off instantly, and then you're kind of letting people tick down a little bit more, not expending too much mana until you're going to be having your Virtue back up, getting everybody topped off here.
As Jack healing is interesting, but not as interesting as Lady Heiko. Let's talk about her abilities really quickly before she does fall to likely Method at the moment, as they are about 10% ahead on the boss. She does have a Focus Lightning where players will need to spread out. If they can clip each other and splash for damage, does a ton of damage. Will also clear away any of these sand dunes, which you need in order to be able to stand on and avoid her static shock. Else you will get, if not one shot, then stunned for a substantial amount of time in the water. Occasionally she'll also summon some small goos that will assist her in combat. Players often like to keep these up in order to boost their single target damage, especially for the rogue as an example, that Shuriken Storm getting those extra combo points on the boss. And lastly are those tornadoes, where you do get popped up. You consume the tornado to make sure it doesn't hit an island, but you do get popped up by the tornado and can get wombo comboed out of there, as we see that cheat death proc on Gingy the rogue on Method.
Yeah, and it looks like he's might have some kind of issues going on as he's just kind of standing off to the side away from everybody else there. But like I said, cheat death does go off. And they're making sure they're staying very, very spread out here for any of the damage going to be going out. Huge damage there on top of the entire group. Very important, like you said, making sure everybody's going to be spread out and kind of rotating through your cooldowns if necessary. But here, as you're seeing, we know when Gingy was having those issues, Games Revolted is pulling ahead here.
Yeah, so they're using that opportunity, of course, as they would, to pull ahead. Gingy having probably some kind of connectivity issues. We'll have to keep an eye on that. Games Revolted now moving over to the Serpentrix trash. A lot of combination of trash here in terms of health pools, where we have, you either have a large mob like the Hydra, of course, some smaller mobs like the crabs, or actually they're kind of the shell crab lobster things on the side there. And then you do have the crabs themselves, as we alluded to earlier, that have the smallest health pool. Really important to focus your damage properly here. 2 deaths, unfortunately, coming out of Method at the end of that boss kill there. Gingy still dead, as he is probably having some problems. But we also had the extra death on Frag as well, which is an unfortunate extra 5 seconds that they start working on the trash 4-man. In the meantime, Games Revolted moving over towards the third boss, excuse me. Apparently counting's not my forte this morning.
Not a problem. I'm here for you.
Thank you, Jack.
Games Revolted here, like you're talking about, clearing off a lot of that extra trash mobs that they have to be dealing with there. It's very important when they're having those large crabs that are getting bolstered again. Whenever you're having the crabs getting pulled into the Hydras, it can be so risky, so scary to be able to kind of see, how large these mobs can get. And a lot of times you'll kind of see, a little bit of extra mobs, and you see more crabs going to be pulled in with, the larger iron shell mob here. Very important to make sure you're getting that kick out, because it will just deal so much damage into the entire group here. But again, it's, the even cleaving, getting everything down, making sure you're having that single target focus onto the larger mobs, because it can be such a pain to deal with here, and it can just delay you by such a long time. And one of the things with Wrath of Ashara, or Eye of Ashara, is when you're used to having these large pulls, when you're used to being able to get everything in together, taking it all out at once, when you are fighting up against something like bolstering, it makes things so much more inconvenient.
Games Revolted with a huge crabs pulling out. Typically crabs, something you want to avoid, especially when you have too many of them here in Eye of Ashara with that bolstering. Just gets so much health going as well. Last Hydra pull coming up here out of Games Revolted, after which they will likely move on to Serpentrix. Now, this trash is, I wouldn't want to say too dangerous, but there's a lot of things you have to watch out for on the floor. A lot of these lightning stars coming out of the Hydra. Huge hit there on Dragon. Should be no problem to heal him up before that Grievous stack gets out of hand, as they do indeed. Only gets 2 stacks of that Grievous. Now, Serpentrix, not the most dangerous boss in the world, but it's a bit time-consuming with those 2 phases, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Child in Time going down here, so accruing another death on the board for Games Revolted, another 5%, and 2 deaths actually coming out of them. They do opt to use actually both of their battle reses right away, something that could cost them a bit later in the match.
It could cost them later in the match if they're not going to be able to, or if they're going to have any kind of little mistakes here and there. But I think it is worth it, because they did skip past some extra mobs early on, and you're seeing Child in Time going down once more here. But these Hydras are just such a pain to be able to deal with. Those kind of random magic attacks that'll be going out onto the tank here, as you're seeing, Chill just running away, making sure
he just doesn't care. He's just getting right out of there.
I wouldn't want to be facing up against that Hydra either.
Neither would I. Undeath over from Frankster on Method on the left side of the screen as well. I mean, a lot of people think about the bolstering, these mobs getting out of hand. The first thing they think about is the tank damage. Oh my god, the tank's going to flop over. And truthfully, there is a lot of tank damage, but there's also a lot of splash residual damage going on. There's a tail swipe from that Hydra. There's a frontal from that Hydra. There's a sandstorm from this shell crab. So there's a lot you have to watch out for. And I mean, case in point here, with 3 deaths on the board from Games Revolted on 1 trash pack, and they burned 2 of their battle reses. Method having similar issues. Of course, they still have the Gingy Gingy issue, but as well, they had a death with their DH on top of it because of the bolstering issue.
And it's while they're in combat, too, so they're not going to be able to get, them rezzed unless they're going to be expending, like you said, expending the battle res, taking up, kind of losing that extra advantage that they, might otherwise want to be leaning on for any of the boss fights here. But you're seeing Games Revolted is engaging with Serpentrix here. Important to note, there are going to be 2 different intermission phases that are going to come up, and you will have, of course, the Fire Head and the Arcane Head that will spawn. Getting those down, getting them killed quickly, and then being able to get focused back onto the boss. So important to be able to have those stuns, those extra interrupts to be able to take down those mobs, shut them down, and for a triple melee comp, it should be pretty easy for them.
Snake. Back to you.
Thanks, Ted.
No, but right here. So with the arcane heads, now it is something really dangerous because the interrupts, especially on the arcane head, he ramps up damage as you tend to not interrupt. So eventually somebody will get one shot. Oftentimes teams at the 33% mark once we get the second transition phase, which is the exact same as this first transition phase we're seeing. The Firehead that will do pulsing AoE damage on the group, and we can see the Arcane Head in the back will do increasing spike damage with those Arcane Blasts on some members as they opt to kill that first for Games Revolted. Now, sometimes Jack, depending on the team, depending on Tyrannical or Fortified for the week, as we see on live servers, some teams opt to just skip that second phase altogether, keep a silence on those heads, and just try to kill Serpentrix off, because of course, as soon as that green main Serpentrix head dies, the encounter is over. But in this case, they don't have some of those advantages coming in from, let's say, a Shadow Priest, which we don't often see in Plus, but for those, a blanket...
Shadow Priest advantage?
Yeah, the Shadow Priest blanket silencer, of course, a beam from a Boomkin, which often buys you time and helps you out a lot with that Arcane Head casting. But it looks like Games Revolted is going just right for it, and they're going to try to finish off the encounter.
Well, one of the things is when we have such a kick-heavy composition here, it makes it so much easier to be able to kind of shut down those mobs before they start ramping up too high here. You are seeing Method, of course, getting Gingy back into the game, back into the fight here. Everyone is getting rezzed up, and they will be able to kind of continue going back at that full strength there. Like you said, Games Revolted just focusing down, that main boss, that main snack head, and making things a lot easier. And even though there is going to be that extra pressure, for example, on Peem, if the healer is able to kind of take that extra risk, take that extra disadvantage here, it makes it so much easier on the rest of the team.
Dragon, of course, deciding he doesn't want to play with his team anymore as he runs off by himself into the cave. Method on the left side of the screen. As you mentioned, now back to full strength. They've been performing this map better up until that point that Gingy had the issues. Their rogue had the issues over on the second boss, so they're going to have to make up a little bit of that time. Dragon is actually stealthing through the cave in order to go all the way around, as they don't really have the ample or appropriate classes to do that skip that we usually see at the dock. So while they're dealing with some of the remaining trash, he's going to go all the way around and likely mount up on that passenger mount, while Games Revolted will then kill this trash, move over to the boat, and then use that mount to jump up and get to the penultimate boss, King Deepbeard.
Yep, and one of the things with the boat skip is while you do have that opportunity to have like the Demon Hunter or Shamans, Druids with Wild Charge, to be able to kind of skip past those things, you also can just get anybody up there mounted up, and people are able to just jump from the boat, and it's a very tight window to be able to click onto that two-seater mount to be able to get up very, very quickly. But as long as you're giving, as long as people are well practiced on this, they should be able to do it no problem. And as long as you have just one person coming up there, then the rogue can just hop down, mount up, get everybody onto the mount, and then shadow step up, which will also transport everybody else as well. So great use of their time here by Games Revolted, making sure they're clearing out the rest of this trash. That way they're not just sitting at the boat and waiting for him. They'll have, just about all the trash that they're going to need. Then they're going to be able to go into Deepbeard.
Unfortunately, a bit of mismanagement on that last crab. That last crab took quite a bit of time to DPS down. They're moving over to the rogue on that mammoth on the side there. Quite a mammoth strategy, if I do say so, Jack. They'll be jumping up in just a moment. As you can see, we've already seen with that blue marker, they do jump onto the mount, immediately dismount. They're safely on the other side. Skip that entire cave sequence that we just saw their rogue do. Method, of course, always keeping an eye on them. Excellent team. They are trying to finish off Serpentrix right now, 33%, after which they will do a similar skip. Now, they might, Jack, be able to save some time with their skip because they do have access to that Demon Hunter, so they will have full strength going straight to that skip.
Yeah,
and they actually already, sorry to cut you off, but they actually already have their trash percentage as well, except for those last 4 mobs that they'll need. So Games Revolted, if I'm not mistaken, will need to kill 1 or 2 more things to get to that 92% threshold before the 4 mobs to have access to Wrath of Ashara.
That's right, and it was kind of weird seeing, Curio just not able to make the jump there. I would have liked to see just the rogue go down, pick him up, get onto that mount, and then have a shadow step that'll carry him up. But instead, you're just seeing him running into the lightning there, and then Peem is able to get the res out onto him. Like you said, even though they are quite a bit behind because they did lose Gingy, they spent that extra time getting all the trash taken care of, and they can all move together as a team, do the boat skip, and then go immediately into Deepbeard here.
Deepbeard, of course, nothing too crazy on this fight. Now, as the tank, or actually as everyone in the fight, you will have to dodge a Quake that he'll pulse soon. You'll see kind of some cracks under the players. That will do some initial damage 5 seconds later after it's applied. You can stack them, in the smart strategy that teams do is you'll see that you'll constantly layer the same Quakes in the same place, doing increasing damage. Now, of course, Jack, if you go to that spot and you accidentally get caught in that aftershock, you will die.
Yeah, but it's very important to note, when you're stacking them, you're having basically an individual stack. Those cracks in the ground will stay there for the entirety of the fight. And like I said, the initial damage that goes out can actually cleave on other players. So it's very important to not stand on top of other people's initial Quakes. So making sure everyone kind of has their own pile here. As you're able to see, Kiro is able to kind of step back, stand on his Quake location, then get back onto the boss here. And everyone's kind of having that nice loose spread. And then also when you have all those Quakes there and Quakes set up, you are going to have the Aftershock.
Method having a bit of issue with the jump there. Imba just, missing that jump twice on the mount, and a bit of miscommunication there at the end as he tried to do his second jump. The Mammoth moved away, so he kind of just face splatted into the wall. Really seconds they can't afford to lose. Finally, they round out and are pulling King Deepbeard as well. But Games Revolted already at 15% on King Deepbeard, handling the bubble mechanics well, handling the frontal on the tank well. They do have to kill just a bit of extra trash leading up to the 4 mobs before Wrath of Ashar, the final boss. But, I mean, they're looking in prime position to be able to finish this boss up. Unfortunately, a last-second death from one of their monks. Again, that's going to cost them an extra 5 seconds. Fortunately, it was towards the end of the map. They don't have the battle res available, but even if they did, they probably wouldn't use it here. It was already sub 10%.
Yeah, when you're in that position, thankfully, like I said, it is fortified. You're not having to have, these... We've seen so many times where you're losing one person, you're not having a battle res available, you're on a tyrannical instance, and it just takes such a much longer time to be able to, get the boss down, and you're just draining your time away. Method here is opting to use their Bloodlust on Deepbeard, and they really need to be able to do whatever they can to kind of catch up here, because like I said, there's a 2-death differential going on between Games Revolted and Method, but they really need to do something big to be able to make sure they're getting back into this game.
And I'll tell you what they're doing. They're doing work on King Deepbeard right now. He is melting, as is expected, of course, with that Bloodlust. Games Revolted moving over to the first 2 of the 4 mobs that you need to kill, that we're kind of adding that protective lightning barrier around Wrath of Ashar. You do need to kill these 4 Naga Enchantresses in order to get access to the last boss. Now, 89%, Jack is not going to cut it. I believe you need about 92-point-something% in order to get access to Wrath of Ashar and finish your trash percentage. Actually, you can do Wrath of Ashar first before finishing your trash percentage. But what we see teams often do is they'll actually do Wrath first, and then go and finish the remaining 2-3% elsewhere by just pulling some crabs or oozes right away.
And one of the most inconvenient things is that a lot of the mobs are just going to be so far away that they otherwise could be able to pull. I mean, they pulled all the mobs that are close in a hate coil. They pulled all the mobs that are easy and quick to deal with around Serpentrix here. So, for getting that extra 1.5% or something like that, if they want to be able to get into a mob that's going to die very quickly, very easily, they're going to be running all the way to the other side of the map, to be able to get some of those Gilbins, to be able to get some of those little extra stalkers that are going to be, going down very quickly. So it's a very big inconvenience to them. And Method, if they're going to be able to, just burn the boss so much more quickly than Games Revolted, which is going to be so tough to do because Games Revolted does have Bloodlust, that would be their only window. But at this point, Games Revolted just needs to play cleanly, and they'll be doing just fine.
Yeah, I mean, they do have that 2-death differential and that bit of trash, so that is really Method's window of opportunity to try and overtake this match, as they themselves are now moving quickly between the mobs in order to get access to Wrath of Ashar, the final boss. Jack, let's talk about this boss, because we're about to see Games Revolted have access to it in a moment. It does start at 20%, so it is in permanent execute range. Nothing that these teams can really take too much advantage of with the comps that they have here. We do have the Bloodlust available from Games Revolted, as we see it popped right away. Now, on this boss, things get out of hand really quickly. This entire platform constantly gets filled with chilled waves, as we see one in the far distance. We have tornadoes spinning around, and we have a few mechanics to deal with that are quite a lot of damage, including the pulsing damage on the group entirely.
That's right, and you're seeing that the tank mechanic there just will have that extra swirl coming out. That's why, you were seeing the tank moving away from everybody else. But as that blue marker does coming down, you are seeing everybody needs to be able to get in and split that damage. Seeing Aura Mastery coming out there by team, making sure you're just reducing the damage as much as you can onto the entire group, because it's important to keep in mind that this is physical damage, so the Paladin can use his Blessing of Protection to be able to hit one player that is affected by it. They're able to run away from everybody else and effectively solo it. You also can have the Rogue, of course, be able to solo it with his Cheat Death. So you have a couple options there to make sure you solo it. Usually it's pretty standard for everyone to stack up for that very first one, especially because you are on Grievous.
You have those cooldowns running on.
Because you have, the prolong power, you have cooldowns, usually you're going to rotate you through your defensives there, and you're not having Grievous really stacking up and kind of draining away a lot of the healer mana and wasting a lot of time. So you're seeing, of course, they are opting to solo these next ones, and Cheat Death going out there by Dragoth.
Yeah, and in, you know, a well-planned cheat death nonetheless. Wrath of Ashara, I mean, this team's really weathering the storm. Wrath of Ashara about to drop here in just a moment. They will need to immediately run off out of here, use probably that Path of Frost from the Blood DK, and pull what I would expect to be the Goose kind of on the left side of the screen from Games Revolted, as we're seeing Method just now starting on the Wrath of Ashara at 17% already for them. They don't have that Bloodlust available. They do have the 2 Battle Res available if needed. And as I alluded to, Games Revolted on the right side of the screen will be immediately Path of Frosting and moving over to pull the last Goose and finish up their 3% if Method can't get the kill within 13% before that.
And it's really all on making sure Games Revolted is able to get the last of these little oozes down very quickly here, and which seems like they'll be able to do because the Method does only have half of the boss health down, and it's, you know, because it does, like you said, start at that 20% here. So at this point, Games Revolted is just mopping up the rest of these little oozes there.
You know, Jack, it's actually going to be closer than we think right now. They need to finish the percent, but they also have a 10-second differential. So Wrath of Ashara, so Method has 10 seconds to finish off Wrath of Ashara after Games Revolted gets that remaining 100%, which is right now 10 seconds left on the clock for Wrath of Ashara in order for Method to stay alive in this best of 3. Can they do it? It doesn't look like they'll be able to pull it off. They have 4 seconds, 3, 2, 1, and it looks, unfortunately, like Games, or fortunately for them, rather, Games Revolted will be taking this series 2-0. I mean, that was closer than a hair, and of course, Rob, we wouldn't know